I'm really excited to be able to talk about this recording scheme about recording wildlife in cemeteries. I'll say a little bit about myself to start off with, and how I got interested in this. So I'm a reader in animal behavior at the University of Edinburgh. My main research is parental care in insects, but I got into biology by being interested in wildlife and natural history. And during lockdown, I started sort of taking interest in natural history again, initially focusing on my own garden. And I got a moth trap, which got me interested in moth trap intruders, and I joined a recording activity called Moth Trap Intruders, which really is quite a big inspiration to setting up this as well. So they have a recording activity that is joined with a Facebook group. I also started then exploring a little bit further away when we were allowed to do that. So I went to a local nature reserve close to me, got interested in beetles, and someone posted a picture of a graveyard beetle, which is quite a rare beetle. And that's kind of what inspired me to go down and have a look in my own local cemetery, which I've kind of used as a shortcut for probably about 10 years before, but not really thinking of it as a place for wildlife. So I went down, had a little look, hoping to find this rare beetle, and of course I didn't. But what I found instead was a lot of ladybirds sitting on gravestones on the trees, and that really got me interested in cemeteries as places for wildlife. So I started thinking about, is this sort of specific just to this cemetery? So I've started visiting other cemeteries in Edinburgh. Is it specific to Edinburgh? So I started going to cemeteries, other places as well. And it's really quite astonishing numbers in some places. So there's one tree in my local cemetery that this year had about 650 individuals of orange ladybirds just under that particular tree. And also once I started looking for ladybirds, you start to see other insects and other species as well. So it really got me interested in cemeteries and kind of what type of animals and also plants and fungi that are living there. So that led me eventually to set up a Cemetery Wildlife Watch as an iRecord activity. And combined with a Facebook group. So this is, as I said, this is really inspired by Moth Trap Intruders, which is a really fantastic iRecord activity and Facebook group. If you're not aware of that, check it out. So I established this then in July 2021. And the purpose of this is to try to record the wildlife that is present at cemeteries across the UK. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with iRecord and iRecord activities. So as Ellen mentioned, iRecord is one of the main platforms for recording wildlife in the UK. And it allows to organize what is called activities. And these activities are used to capture biological records for specific sites or areas. So it could be for organizations or species groups. But it also allows you to do this for projects in a way that is not, where it's not always easy to collate the records in any other way. And they will then be, these records will be contributing to the recording schemes and the local environmental centers in just the same way as any other record, and they'll be verified by experts in just the same way as any other record that you submit to iRecord. Now, this particular activity is focused then on biological records from cemeteries, churchyards, and burial grounds. And this is information that otherwise would be quite difficult to collate from iRecord. You can collate information about records from particular areas or particular species groups, but it's quite difficult to collate them for things like cemeteries. So having an activity can be a good way to allow people to access records of the type of species that we find in cemeteries and burial grounds. To join, just register for an iRecord account, just search the activities for Cemetery Wildlife Watch, and you can join that way. So it's a bit slow to react. Okay. There is a Facebook group as well associated with this activity, and you can join that as well. And the purpose of this is to support the recording activity, share news and records of wildlife, but also provide some help with identification, and also providing monthly updates on the progress of the recording activity. There's about 150 members right now. I should also mention that there is an alternative recording activity for cemeteries called Our Beautiful Burial Grounds. And some of you who are present here might also be contributing to this recording activity. They use both iRecord and iNaturalist as platforms, and they are for Wales and England only. They're run by Caring for God's Acre, which is a national conservation charity that's promoting conservation of cemeteries, churchyards and burial grounds. And they have really quite a lot of good resources. So if you're interested in cemeteries and wildlife there, check out this particular charity as well. So why cemeteries? What's interesting about them in terms of wildlife? I think there's several reasons why cemeteries are actually really interesting or very useful. They're very important green spaces, especially in urban areas. And it'd be really useful to know a little bit more about what type of organisms are living there. They can be very good habitats. So a lot of cemeteries are quite old. They will have a good diversity of very mature trees. And they're not very intensively managed. There's very often not much use of pesticides, for example. And they're also very accessible. So in my case, my local cemetery is only about 10 minutes walk from where I live. So they're very accessible to most of us. And now I even check out where the cemeteries are when I go on holidays. So this is a photograph from Lewis, where I went on holiday last year, and I checked out some of the cemeteries up there as well. And they're very, very different from the ones that I have locally in Edinburgh. The other good things about cemeteries, the gravestones actually provide a way for recording species in a way that's non-intrusive, just by looking at what is sitting on the gravestones. And because they're quite a flat surface, it can be quite easy to spot smaller species that otherwise would be quite hard to see. And you can also watch them in a way that where you don't actually disturb their behavior. You can see some of the ways that they behave and the type of interactions they have, which would be difficult to get access to if you do sweeping or beating and so on, which is traditional ways for often recording insects. I'll come back to this a little bit later on. Cemeteries is also very variable, so they will vary in size and age and what type of trees there are and how they're managed, and also which locations there are. So there's also quite interesting differences between cemeteries in what type of wildlife will be there. And this is all information that might be useful to people who are managing cemeteries. I know that, for example, the local council here in Edinburgh are very keen to manage cemeteries in a way that is beneficial for biodiversity. And information about what lives there can be useful in terms of improving how they're managed and how cemeteries are good habitats for wildlife. So I'll move on to say a little bit about the activity. So the current status of the activity is that we have about 9,800 records right now, nearly 1,200 species. And there's about 33 recorders that are currently active. It would be great to get more people to join in. So please think about that if you are interested in recording wildlife in cemeteries. We have records from across much of the UK, from Orkney in the north to Guernsey in the south. But there's quite a few areas that are not particularly well covered as well. So it'd be great to get more people involved and contributing to the records and to what we know. I'll just briefly show a little bit about the diversity of things that we record. I think this is one of the things that's perhaps most exciting about this to me, is that there's a lot of different types of wildlife that are present in cemeteries, and it allows you to really try to be quite a generalist and learn different species groups that maybe weren't so familiar with initially. So if you look at some of these records in terms of number of species, the most recorded group of flowering plants, which is perhaps not surprising. But we also have beetles and tree bugs, probably the two groups where we have the most number of records. I won't really go through this list, but there's a wide range of different species groups, lichens obviously being a group that a lot of people have been recording from cemeteries for decades. And some of the other groups, crustaceans are also quite common, amphibians, and horsetails and so on. So there's a lot of different types of groups that you can find in cemeteries. And the ones, kind of the more unusual things that we can find, also things like this snakefly and bristletails. So it's a lot of diversity, different types of groups. And it would be really good to get kind of more information about all the different types of species that we find here. I'll spend some time going through some of the more specific groups that you might be able to find. So I mentioned ladybirds already, and this is certainly the most recorded family of species of animals that we have so far. There's about 2,800 records. We have records about 27 species. And if you haven't done much biological recording before, this is a really good group to get started with. There's good ID resources that you can access here, and there's also a very active recording scheme that will verify records that you are putting in as well. Some of the species that are most common, at least that have been recorded so far, are these species. So this is two-spot, orange, and pine ladybirds, 10-spot, cream spot, and harlequin ladybirds. These are the 6 most commonly recorded species so far. And many of these species are wintering on gravestones. So you can actually go down in your local cemetery and have a look during midwinter. You may not perhaps expect to find many insects at that time, but some of these ladybirds will be wintering on gravestones at that time. There are also some less common species that you might find. So these are some of the other species that I found here in Edinburgh. So this is larch, pied, 18-spot on the top here, and then cream-streaked Adonis and heather ladybird. And the last species I mentioned because it was found by first by some students who are doing projects with me on wintering ladybirds here in Edinburgh, and this was the first record of heather ladybird for the Vice County Midlothian. So really exciting find for us. So ladybirds is a really good group to get started with, and they are really quite common, at least here in Edinburgh. But I know from speaking to people who live in other parts of the UK that they're not always common in other parts, other cities. For example, Bristol and Ipswich, I'm told there are no ladybirds or very few ladybirds on gravestones for some reason. So this would be something that would be interesting to try to look into a bit more, as well as why is there such diversity in which species are present. We also record a few other beetles, so I'll mention some of those that we have found. We have about 400 records of other species, so not ladybirds, and about 100 different species that have been recorded. They tend to be found mostly on gravestones under trees, so that seems to be the best place to look for them. Some of the species are quite common, like this rosemary leaf beetle, but there's also some smaller and a bit scarcer arboreal species that we are finding, including this species on the right here, which is called Floiophilus edwardsi, and it's quite a rare species, quite small, about 2-3 millimeters. and it's not that many records of this species, but we've been finding it now fairly regularly in the winter, both in Edinburgh and also in Norwich on gravestones. I'll mention a couple of species that I find particularly interesting. There's one here called Raboceris gabrieli. This is quite a scarce species in the UK. So there's about 50 records on the NBN Atlas from 1900 up to 2020. So that's not very many. And it has status as local or uncommon in the UK. But since starting this and looking for ladybirds and other things, I've found it on 21 occasions in Edinburgh in the winter, and it's usually then on gravestones under or near trees. And this is a very poorly known species. It's underrecorded, probably. And what we can learn from these records is that it's active during the winter, and it's also quite active during the day, which is something we didn't really know. And it is overwintering as an adult. I mentioned the graveyard beetle as a species that sort of was the inspiration for me to go down to the graveyard. I didn't see it initially, but after about a year of doing this, I did eventually find it. But this is also another species that is quite rare and in the UK. But since this activity started, we now found 5 activity records of this species from Norwich. It's found by someone else, and then I found it 3 times in Edinburgh and once in Dundee. So it is possible to find some rare species of beetles as well when doing this. Just being out there looking, you will find something exciting now and then. Another good group to get started with, if you haven't done much biological recording in cemeteries, will be true bugs, Hemiptera. We have about 1,500 records and about just over 100 species. And these are species that you often find on gravestones under trees as well. And this includes shield bugs. So shield bugs have quite good resources for identification, so they should be quite straightforward to identify. So these are red-legged hawthorn, parent bug, and juniper shield bugs. So these are all species that we find fairly regularly in Edinburgh. The red-legged shield bug is the second most recorded species for the activity, for example. And it will be recorded both as an adult, which I've shown here, but also as a nymph, especially during the winter as they are overwintering as nymphs. There's quite a few other bugs that we're finding as well. So this is Campylonura virgula, the beetle on the left, sorry, the bug on the left. This is a species that is associated with trees. It's quite small and delicate, but it's possible to find it by looking closely on gravestones under trees. We're also finding some other beetles in Edinburgh now that are expanding the ranges, or at least moving north. So these are 2 species of Deriocoris flavilinea and lutescens. And these were species that weren't in Edinburgh, as far as we know, until fairly recently. But for example, of this species on the right here, so Deriocoris lutescens, we now have about 94 records of this species from cemeteries in Edinburgh. So this is quite a common species by the looks of it here now. Some of the more exciting things we found is in this particular species of a leafhopper. So this is a leafhopper that is quite widespread in the UK, but it is very scarce, and it's associated with lime. And after starting this activity, I now found it twice in Edinburgh, and those were the first records of this species from Scotland. And you can see from the distribution map here that there's a big gap between the records that were of this species that where it had been found previously, and now these records from Edinburgh. It's probably scarce in the UK, but widespread. So there's a species that you might be lucky to find. Another species that I found that was new to Scotland is this very small bug. It's just about 2 to 3 millimeters. So it's very difficult to see probably otherwise. But again, it's possible to find it by looking carefully on gravestones under trees. This is a non-native species. It's a species that originally came from North America, but it's well established in the UK, and it's now probably spreading north as well. And since looking at gravestones, I now found it about 40 times in Edinburgh, so it's clearly well established, and it's just not been noticed previously, probably just because it's just so small. But Cemeteries provides a good sort of place to look for these things, because you can detect them and see them on the gravestones. One group that don't get a lot of attention perhaps, but we have been finding quite a bit as part of this activity are barkflies, and this is quite a good group to get into if you want to find something that is a bit more unusual. They're often under-recorded, so there's often quite poor records of them across the UK. We have about 500 records of 20 different species, so there's about 50 something species in the UK, so we have covered quite a good proportion of the species. And the places to look for them again will be gravestones under trees. They're quite small, so just about 3 millimeters, maybe a bit smaller, maybe a bit bigger, depending on the species. But it is possible to detect them by looking quite carefully. And I found 2 new species to Scotland just from doing this. One of them is this species on the right here. This is called Peripsocus milleri, and it's a non-native species, possibly from New Zealand. There's quite a few records of it in England, but it's obviously now also spreading north and into Scotland. Quite a few of these barkflies are non-native species, so it's quite interesting to keep an eye on them as well, and kind of how they're doing. And some of them are quite interesting in that they have really established themselves very, very quickly. Like this species on the left here is a South American species called Chilenos Cecilius ornatopennis, and it was first discovered in the UK in 2015, so fairly recently, but it's now probably spread across all over the UK just in a few years. And this is a species that's fairly easy to recognize. It's got these sort of creamy, milky wings and this sort of reddish go faster stripe behind the eyes. There are a few other species or groups that we're finding as well. So moths is another group that I've started looking a bit more for now. You have about 430 records of moths, about 132 species. This is not using a moth trap, so this is just looking at things that are sitting on gravestones, maybe doing netting, and also looking for leaf mines on leaves. One thing that I am finding in the winter when I'm looking for ladybirds are these wingless females of wintering of moths that are active in the winter. This is a dotted border moth, but also find winter moths, for example, that will have these wingless females. So if you are out looking for wildlife on gravestones and in cemeteries, you might also come across some of these moths. And the species on the right here, this is a very small leaf miner, quite attractive. It's very, very small. The wing length is just about 3 to 4 millimeters, but it's something, again, because it's sitting on the gravestone, you might be lucky to find it. Probably otherwise it would be really difficult to see. Another group that is quite commonly found on gravestones and that has a very active recording scheme are harvestmen. So we have about 464 records for 15 species, and some of the species are very, very common. And you can find them on gravestones. Some of them will be under rocks or logs as well. So the one on the left here, Platybenus pinatorium, that is a non-native species. It's been in the UK for a few years. It's spreading north now, and in other parts of the UK it has been replacing other native species. So it's one that would be good to kind of keep a track on how it's doing, and also how the other species in that genus are doing. And then these are some of the other species of harvestmen that we find. This is quite a common one in the middle. So this is Leabunum rotundum, a male. And this is a species that is quite commonly found on gravestones under trees. And the one on the right here is one that I haven't found very often, but when I do, it's always a treat. It's a very small species. It's called Megabunus diadeum, and it's got these really spiky eyebrows, which are really make it quite attractive to look at. But it's not a species I'm finding very often, sadly. Birds and mammals. So there are obviously quite a lot of birds and mammals that are using cemeteries as well. We have some records of birds and mammals, but we haven't really been focusing massively on these groups. So it'd be great to get more people involved who would be doing that. So this is a hybrid crow that I spotted in Edinburgh. There's a small population of hybrid crows that are breeding here, and some of them are turning up in my local cemetery. So that's one of the more exciting things I've seen. And then I'm also finding molehills sometimes in some of the cemeteries I'm visiting. So there are certainly mammals that are using cemeteries, but we don't have a lot of records of them. Plants. So this is the group that we have the most species for, but we haven't made a start, if you like, with recording plants that are present in cemeteries. I don't record a lot of plants myself. I'm kind of more of an insect person, but it would be really good to get more people involved who would be recording plants, so we have a bit more of an idea of the plants that we have in the cemeteries. So more records would certainly be appreciated for this group. And finally, fungi is also a group that is very much present in cemeteries. Cemeteries are really good habitat for many fungi. We have some records, we made some start here, but again, it would be good to get more people involved who would be recording the fungi that we have in cemeteries. So I mentioned initially that I'm interested in behavior, and doing this is also, you can detect some interesting behaviors, because when you're looking at gravestones, you're doing the non-intrusive type of recording. You're not disturbing the animals, and you can actually get some information about what they're doing and the type of behaviors they have. And a couple of things that I found is on the left here, there's this quite a common beetle called Dromius quadrimaculatus. It's an arboreal species, but I found it on several occasions where it's mingling with wintering ladybirds. So it's just sort of hiding within the cluster of ladybirds, just sitting in there, hanging out with them for a little while. It's not wintering there, because when I go back a day or two later, it's gone, but it's probably spending the day sitting among the ladybirds, hiding there for whatever reason, probably for protection, and then it's moving on and moving somewhere else. So it's a behavior that's not been described for this species before, and would probably be difficult to detect otherwise. And another thing I've also found is this bark fly. So this is Valenzuela flavidus. It's a very common bark fly in the UK. And when I looked at this photograph that I took in the field, looked at this photograph carefully afterwards, I noticed that it's actually sitting on this silk nest with eggs underneath. And this wasn't something that I was aware of, even though my specialty is parental care. And it's not something that has been described in the literature, but I've since found a couple of other photographs of this happening in this species. So I'm pretty sure that this is something that this species is actually doing, but it would be really useful to get more records of this behavior. Other interesting things that you can detect are various types of interactions. For example, these parasitoids. So these are zombies and mummies. So on the left here is a parasitoid wasp that's parasitizing ladybirds. This is called Dinocampus coxylina, and it actually keeps the ladybird alive after it's emerged from the ladybird. So this ladybird here is guarding this cocoon. It's sort of twitching and chasing away things that are coming close to it, and this way protecting the cocoon against potential predators. And if the parasitoid doesn't keep this ladybird alive, then it's very vulnerable to predation. So this is a way for this parasitoid basically to use the ladybird as a bodyguard and protect itself. And on the right here is a mummy wasp. So these are parasitoid wasps of caterpillars that are turning these caterpillars into mummies. And these are actually quite commonly found on gravestones as well. So hopefully you are interested in doing this. So you can get involved and help improve the knowledge that we have of biodiversity in cemeteries. And this can be useful in terms of improving the management of cemeteries as well. It's also a good way, I think, to apply and learn natural history knowledge. And it's suited for people who are novices, who maybe haven't done much biological recording before, because quite a lot of these groups are the good resources available. They're quite conspicuous and they're quite straightforward to identify from photos as well. But it's also useful for people who are more experienced naturalists. It's also a good way to become a naturalist or generalist. So if you have really generalist interest in natural history, this is a good place to apply that knowledge or even learn about other groups, or you can be a specialist. So I'm generally interested in insects, but by doing this, I'm also learning about fungi and mosses and a few other groups. So it's a good way to sort of expand on your general natural history knowledge. And there's a really good range of different organisms that you might find in a cemetery: birds, mammals, insects, and plants and fungi, and so on. So hopefully, if you're interested, please consider joining the activity. And also you can join the Facebook group just by register for an iRecord account and just search for activities. And I think that was the end of that. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Per. That was fascinating to listen to. We have had a few questions in the chat to get us started. So a nice one first from Jody would be, what is your #1 tip for a first-timer spotting wildlife in cemeteries?
Yeah, I think going maybe in the winter, and a cemetery that has a lot of mature trees would be the best place. Go to gravestones under trees and have a close look in sort of the crevices that will be on the undersides or on the gravestones. So that's often where you can find ladybirds and other species wintering. So, but you will find very different things different times of the year. So I go year round, and in the winter I find often wintering species and species that are active in the winter. But then now in the summer I find often quite different species. So different times of the year, often different types of opportunities and different types of species. But I would pick a cemetery with mature trees and really go very close up to the up to the gravestones and have a look at them. And hopefully you'll find things that way.
Thanks, Per. Moving on to the next question, back to the start of your presentation about ladybirds. Somebody asked, is the high recording of ladybirds a bias because they're easier to identify than other species?
Yes, I would take all the numbers that I've shown you with a big pinch of salt, because they are reflecting the interest of the people recording. I record, for example, when I go to cemeteries, I always record ladybirds. So there will be a bias towards ladybirds. They are easy to spot. They're very common, at least in Edinburgh. And therefore there will be a lot of records of them. And I guess on a wider note, I guess there will always be biases with biological recording like this, because it depends on the interest of the people who are doing it. But I think one thing that where it would be useful to have more people involved is that it won't be the bias of a small number of people, but biases of many people, and that might be a better representation of what is actually present than the bias of a small number of people. So I think the more people that are involved, somehow the overall bias might be less than if there's just a smaller group. So yeah, get involved.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
We could now come to Tony, who's got their hand up.
Oh, thanks for that. Per, excellent talk. Really enjoyed that. That was fun. Here in East London, we're quite a few of us really heavily involved in recording across most of East London, past North East London. We also have the London Natural History Society. I'm actually one of the recorders for Bees and Moths for that society. And we've really focused quite heavily on cemeteries, churchyards, graveyards, and the parks that have been merged from disused cemeteries. And they are, you rightly said, they're fantastic resources. We also seem to have quite a few relic species around from days gone past, when we find that there are plants and some wildlife that have been left over from the days when they were fields and open countryside. So really interesting from that point of view. The only thing that worries me a little bit as a recorder is the call out for everybody to get involved with your particular sort of activity means it can kind of result in overlapping recording. Not necessarily a problem, but can be a bit of an issue when we're looking at numbers. I just wondered if you had any comments on that, and we can probably talk later outside this meeting as well, because I've got some questions for you anyway.
Yes, so I mean, I think the usefulness of having an activity is that it allows you to collate information about animals or plants that are present in cemeteries. This is quite difficult to do otherwise, I think, with the way that iRecord is set up. You can collate information about specific taxonomic groups or particular areas, but it's more difficult to do it for things like cemeteries.
I agree to say, I mean, what I've started doing is if I want to look at a particular area of recording, is you can actually run an outline within iRecord and then see what's actually present in that particular graveyard area, which makes it much easier to coordinate people and activities locally, which I think is my fear with this.
I think, I don't know if you specifically asked about, so certainly people should not be double recording. So if you are recording normally, if you like, and you have already recorded things, do not record those observations again in an activity. That will sort of generate a lot of extra work for the people who are verifying it.
I mean, that was my point really, is to make sure that doesn't happen, but also not to find a way of coordinating activities so that different groups are coming together to look at particular graveyards, cemeteries, etc., with a coordinated, and we used to call it bio-blitzes, but these major recording events are very useful from that point of view. And also coming about bees in particular are very good indicator species for most of our cemeteries, partly because the ground is very suitable for a lot of mining bees. So I noticed you had only 60 odd hymenopteron records, which seems very low.
So that's partly again reflecting the interest of the people who are recording. So there's some of the people who are recording for this activity are recording bees, but they're recording the bees in a different way. And this is something that, you know, people might be submitting spreadsheets to for a particular group and have done that before. And I think people should just do things in a way that's convenient for them, obviously. But hoverflies as well, many people record hoverflies by submitting spreadsheets directly to the recording schemes rather than doing it through iRecord. So, and that's probably also probably have fewer records of hoverflies for that reason too. But yeah, it would be good to coordinate. I'm not saying that everyone has to join this particular activity. I think it's good to try to collate the way that records from cemeteries are recorded. So our beautiful burial grounds is another recording activity, which is really good, and they have a lot of records. So if I were to try to work out what species are present in cemeteries, I would also look at their records. And there will be other recording schemes as well, or recording activities that will be based on cemeteries as well.
Just one last comment. It's one thing that I have found with the cemeteries and burial grounds is they're absolutely excellent teaching grounds. Yeah. If you want to take people around, it's an enclosed, usually quite a safe area, and it's excellent for organising events to help people get to grips with even the common species as well as the rarer ones. So it's a really good thing to promote.
I agree. We do that in Edinburgh too. We running projects both with honours students, doing projects on wintering ladybirds, but also teaching projects. And it's a really good way of doing that, and do outreach with schools and so on. So I agree completely. Good points.
Thanks for that. Great questions. Coming back to a couple of earlier questions we had through to the chat. Carol asked, do you have to kill many of the Coleoptera that you find in order to identify them to species level?
No, I prefer not to. I don't do dissection. So if there's species I can't identify from photographs, I tend to record them as a genus level. So, but I know people will do different things, but personally, I prefer to try to identify them from photographs. Sometimes I will collect them and do photographs in a more controlled way. It might be difficult to get them to behave and to sit still on a gravestone, so I might collect them temporarily, but then take them back and release them. So that's what I do personally. I try not to collect things for killing. Try to make sure that they can get on with their things. A lot of these groups that we are focusing on are things that you can identify from photographs. So I've invested in a small camera, Olympus Tough TG6, which is really good for macro photography, and that allows me to take photographs that I can identify from. And it's a bit of practice for how to use the camera, and also maybe try to learn how to take the photographs so that you can identify things from them. So often you need a sideways photograph, you might need a photograph from the top. Sometimes you need one from the front, and with a bit of experience, you will kind of learn how to do that, so you can identify things from photographs.
Really good advice. Amy has also asked, is there a noticeable difference between diversity and richness of species around more recently placed gravestones compared to older gravestones?
Yes, definitely. I'm not so sure it's so much to do with the gravestone. I think it's probably more to do with what is around it. So the best places I tend to find are gravestones under mature trees. And also the type of tree can matter. So for example, in my local cemetery, there's a mature Scots pine. Most of the other trees are lime or horse chestnut. And I always check out the Scots pine because it has different species associated with it. I can find striped ladybirds, eyed ladybirds, and I never find them under any other tree species. So the type of tree can also matter, but certainly gravestones under mature trees tend to be better. I went to the Outer Hebrides I mentioned last summer, and there aren't any trees in most of the cemeteries there, and so there will be much less diversity of things to find, but still I've found things up there as well.
Thank you, Per. Moving on to our next question, we've had one from an animal behaviour graduate who has asked, are there any papers or studies that can be built out of this? And they said, I imagine it would be really difficult to balance scientific behavioural observation with being non-invasive and respectful of the graveyard, but that they would like to learn more.
Yes, so currently it's kind of more a fun thing to do. But it has potential to lead to some kind of scientific papers as well. I mean, for example, this observation that this beetle is hiding among ladybirds, this Dromius quadrimaculatus. Once you're starting to get a sufficient number of observations of this happening, it is possible to publish this as at least a note in a coleopteran journal. So I imagine that this can lead to research like that. The observations of the parental care as well, I think, is something that you can use as a pilot study, and then maybe if you want to do kind of more proper experiments with it, you might collect individuals and maybe try to raise them in the lab. But certainly as a pilot study and kind of a way to learn about the behavior of these animals in the natural context, I think is a good starting point. But I agree, it probably would be difficult to do experiments in the cemetery. I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Thank you, Per. Someone has asked, are there any underrepresented species or groups that would benefit from people specializing in order to record them?
Probably most of the groups are under-recorded. I think maybe the only group that's well represented are the barkflies, because I'm quite fond of them. I didn't really know anything about barkflies before I started this, but it's one of the things, you know, you learn and discover things when you do this. But apart from that, I would say that nearly every group is probably under-recorded, except for ladybirds. The beetles as well. I mean, we recorded about 127 different species of beetles, but that's just a very small proportion of the beetles that we have. Likewise for bugs, we have about 100 species now, but that's again is a fairly small proportion. So nearly all the groups are underrepresented. Plants, lichens, mosses, fungi, all of them are underrecorded. Even birds and mammals are underrecorded. So almost anything, any records, I think, will be useful and valuable.
Amazing. Well, that's a great call to action for any generalists or specialists that are with us watching this. Fab. We have time for a couple more questions, and someone has asked, do you need permission from caretakers of graveyards or cemeteries to get involved and do this?
Not if you are just walking around and taking photographs. You don't really need permission, but you should be considerate of other users, obviously. Most of the cemeteries I visit are historic cemeteries, so they're not actively used as burial grounds anymore, but some of them are. And obviously, if there is a ceremony going on, you need to be very considerate of that. And likewise, visitors to graves, you need to be considerate of people are visiting graves. There are quite a lot of other people using cemeteries, so dog walkers, people just going for a walk. So there are many other people using cemeteries, and you don't need permission for it. If you're doing something that is a bit more involved in taking big groups there, I would ask for permission from the council to do that. But just going on my own, I don't do that.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone has also asked, is there any way of assessing population size of mammals such as hedgehogs? How this could feed into that, I suppose, more broadly.
I've never seen a hedgehog in a cemetery. I wish I had. Yeah, there might be possible to do that. I think in general there might be good ways to use cemeteries to monitor populations. I haven't really thought about mammals per se, but say wintering ladybirds, certainly And it's something that I am quite keen to do, to repeat the counts every year and look at how the populations are changing. And I think you can do that with other groups as well. I haven't specifically thought about hedgehogs since I've never actually seen them in the cemetery yet, but maybe someone else has. So maybe they are quite common in some cemeteries, which would be great.
I actually saw a dead hedgehog, sadly, in a cemetery this week, but that would be the first one that I've seen as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. We've just had one question through to the chat from Eloise saying, I wonder how camera trapping could be applied in cemeteries.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, we haven't really done much trapping of any type. So camera trapping would probably pick up things like foxes and badgers, which I assume will be using cemeteries in many places. We haven't done any bat recording either, for example. So I'm assuming there will be lots of bats species, or we haven't used moth traps. So there are lots of things I think that could be done. Wildlife cameras would be one good way to try to expand on the things that we can see just with the naked eye, visiting normally during the day. Yeah, it's a good point, good suggestion.
Fantastic. That is all the questions we've had through, and perfect timing because we're just coming up to 2 o'clock. So we will wrap up there, and we have placed the link to join the Cemetery Wildlife Watch Facebook group in the chat, and hopefully one of our team can just pop it in again now so that it is there for everyone to see. So yeah, I would just encourage everyone here to get involved. I'm certainly aiming to do so and get some Cornwall records on that map in future where I'm based. And thank you so much for this talk, Per. It's been really amazing to hear about the discoveries and trends in cemeteries. And yes, thanks everyone for joining us. I don't know if you had any last comments you wanted to share, Per.
No, thank you very much to everyone who's been here. Also, thanks for the questions. There've been some interesting questions to think about there as well. So that is very useful.
Amazing. All right, thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and see you next time.